I'm acutely aware that it's long past lunchtime and I don't want to delay you. If I see people sneaking out of the back of the room, I will forgive you in advance. This title, it's not me. I switched mine off hours ago, as I was supposed to have done. This title was actually suggested by Nagla, and when she suggested it, I wasn't really sure that I was prepared to do anything. But when I thought about it, I realised that maybe one could make some interesting observations. So that's all these are. And let's ask by what we mean by sustainable. And so I went to the dictionary, and the dictionary says it means capable of being born or endured, upheld or defended. That didn't seem to be terribly useful. And so I went a bit further, and it seems to be interpreted by many people as meaning being able to meet the needs. Well, you can read it, I don't need to read it out to you. Being able to meet the needs of future generations. Now, this is a very curious sort of thing to impose upon people, and the question is, can we in fact do it? So I noticed that the whole concept of sustainability is very dependent on what your attitude to these sorts of things are and who you are and what your position is. And remember that if you're talking about the adoption of what might be called sustainable measures in society, then you have to figure in also the political dimension of the people who are making the laws and what their idea is. And we see that very clearly now in parts of Europe where governments are backtracking from their enthusiasm with wind farms as rapidly as they possibly can, for two sorts of reasons. First of all, the population doesn't actually like wind farms, because people who live near them object to their presence. They say they're unsightly and they're noisy. And secondly, they finally realised that they are not economically viable in the circumstances of the present time, and there are better ways of getting energy. So they are stuck in a position where they really would like not to go any further, particularly with onshore wind farms, and yet they appear to have made treaty obligations where they feel they have to go ahead. So there's a mixture of official position and official policy, and then what individual people will decide to do, whether in fact you put your recycling material properly in the recycling bin. And that's a question for millions of people all around the world to decide what they want to do. So nothing is sustainable forever. I think we have to bear in mind that sustainability has to have limits, and one of the things we really need to do is to be reasonable about what sort of limits we're talking about. So I had to think about that, and I asked myself the question that if one is designing policies for sustainability, how far ahead are you prepared to look? Are you designing for 5 years, or 10 years, or 50 years, or 100 years, or 1,000,000 years? What do you mean when you say something is sustainable? So I had to think about that, and I realized that 50 years is probably as far ahead as you could look. And if you think back, I don't know how many people in this room, having a quick look around this room, only some of you will remember what it was like 50 years ago. So if you put your minds back to 1962, and you ask yourself, what in 1962 did I think 2012 would look like? Most people didn't think about it, and most people would have got it wrong. One of the things that, I mean, if I go back for a moment, there are some remarkable things that have happened between 1962 and now, which a few people might have seen, but most people didn't. One of them was the disappearance of the Soviet Union. Nobody in 1962 thought that the Soviet Union would disappear within 20 or 25 years. Nobody, except for a very few visionary people, imagined that we would have an internet and mobile telephones, and yet those are now absolutely commonplace. And you simply have to be very careful about what you're going to think about how the world is going to look in 2062 or 2112. It's really beyond our reasonable imagination. So by 50 years from now, we ought to know whether the world population is really going to plateau where people predict it is. we should have a better idea of the extent of climate change, or whether indeed the climate change skeptics are right. And 50 years is a very long time, however, and we could be very wrong in what we predict will happen in that time. So we need to be careful with predictions, and we need to be careful not to take too hasty an action, and we need to be careful to put ourselves in a position where we can back off if we need to, as indeed they're doing with the wind farms. So it's all very well to be sustainable and to be careful, but you have to be reasonable as well. So in that sort of context, how can ag biotech help? Well, you must remember that ag biotech is an enabling technology. It may be one of the more powerful ones, and one of the main things it will enable us to do, or we hope it will enable us to do, is to conserve land and conserve water, to conserve resources, so that we hope to be able to produce more food with no more input resources, and if possible with fewer input resources. And that therefore will minimize the demand of agriculture and agricultural activities for existing resources. Remember that all cropping activities, that's to say removing plant material from the land in which it was grown and taking it somewhere else, deprives the soil of essential elements. So people have talked about taking agricultural produce off the land and taking it into the urban areas for people to eat and then for their waste to be disposed of. So when you crop land, you remove nitrogen and you remove other elements, of which one of the most sensitive is phosphorus. And you know very well that nitrogen can be recovered with enough energy from the atmosphere, but phosphorus has to be, at the present time, has to be mined. And the sources of inorganic phosphate around the world are gradually becoming exhausted, and I don't know what the state of affairs will be in 50 years' time. I don't know how much of the existing resources will remain, and I don't know how many new ones will have been discovered, but it's an important issue, and one has to bear that sort of thing in mind when you're thinking about sustainability. So if you can increase yields, however you do that, however, whether you have more fruitful crops or more nutritious crops, or fewer weeds, or fewer diseases, or fewer degradation of a product when you've done it, it's all a benefit, and it reduces the pressure on the use of land. And if you can minimize the inputs of all the agricultural chemicals and the fuels that you use, again, you will reduce the demand for energy and for resources in the land. And same for post-harvest losses and food decay. So biotech is so powerful because it can make use of a wider gene pool, as you know. I don't really need to go into this anymore. That's been adequately dealt with. So there are some take-home lessons that agricultural technology is a technology. It's a set of techniques which enable you to do things. It doesn't prescribe what it is that you have to do. It's not a panacea for dealing with every agricultural problem. You have to use it intelligently, has enormous potential, but it's not infinite. It can be a very powerful way of dealing with problems, providing the problems are characterized and defined so that you know what it is that you're trying to do, because ag biotech is a very precise activity, and therefore it will address specific problems, and that means therefore that you have to define the problem that you want to have addressed. And as with all technologies, it is not born perfect. All technologies, as I made a point yesterday, all technologies are born imperfect and develop as we use them. As we gain experience and confidence in the use of technologies, they become more extensive and they become more effective and less prone to failure. So we cannot expect biotechnology, ag biotechnology, any sort of biotechnology, which after all is only 20, 30 years old, to be perfect. And it isn't. It works most of the time in the present circumstance. It doesn't work all the time. It doesn't resolve every issue for which it is being brought to play, and we will learn continuously how to get better at it. So we've got to manage it properly for maximum benefit and for maximum detriment, the minimum detriment. So there are some factors affecting aggregate yields: land availability and water and the soil minerals and sunlight and innate crop productivity and atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration and crop resistance to pests and climatic factors and markets, all of these things will affect the way agriculture behaves and the way agriculturalists go about their business. So that if you look at what biotechnology has done, you can look at what it is already doing. And it is already, as we know, introducing specific pest resistances, which result in less pesticide, more direct application of pesticides, so less adventitious damage to other organisms, encouragement of no-till agriculture, which lowers the use of fuel and the manufacture of machinery, if you like, and the compaction of the soil which results. You get increased yields, which means less pressure on the land than there would otherwise be. The reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, if they turn out to be as important as people think. Drought-tolerant crops, and there will be other sorts of crops which are available for use on land which is of poor quality, and new improved fibres, and maybe other output measures which will come into being. And then there are benefits which may come, which people would like to develop, and some people are already trying to develop, but which we're not there yet. One of them is whoops, I've gone too far, I think. A more extensive and effective drought resistant. People are beginning to develop plants which are drought resistant. There are the beginnings of these varieties already on the market, but they are at an early stage and we don't know how far we will be able to go. We want enhanced stability to grow on various sorts of marginal land. Improved cold and heat tolerance, which already important, but could be even more important if the world's climate changes in any marked way. The ability to fix atmospheric nitrogen would save an enormous amount of industrial effort in nitrogen fixation, and people are working on it. They have been working on it for decades, and I was talking to someone recently, and the confidence is growing that they will be able to do it, but they haven't done it yet, and you know, in the end it may not work as well as people would like. Improved photosynthetic productivity and efficiency is another measure which people would like to be able to achieve. Whether that's going to be possible, we don't know. New routes for nutritional supplements, new and improved fibres perhaps, and other ways in which you could improve output. So all of these things are possible, maybe, and if they were successful, they would all reduce the pressure on land. In that sense, you would be able to sustain existing activities over a longer period, and you would also be able to preserve non-agricultural land in its present condition. Now, Naglar suggested mentioning technology benefits still to come, and I have to say I thought I'd leave that to people's imagination and inventiveness, because I know perfectly well that new technologies will develop, but I am no better than anybody else at imagining what they might be. And I will refer you back to the 50 years ago scenario, that I was no better 50 years ago than other people in imagining what was going to happen in 50 years' time. And in fact, as far as I can remember, I didn't think about it. So I think the crux of the matter, as far as I can see, if there's a single point which is of the greatest importance with regard to sustainability, it is the availability of energy. Because with energy, you can do anything. With energy, you can move mountains. With energy, 3,000 and a bit years ago, the guys down the road built pyramids. Now, the stones that they built the pyramids from were there in the ground. They had to be cut out. What they needed was the energy to get the stuff out, to make the stones, to put them in position. And it was with that, it was the most unbelievable effort for the time. With that, they were able to do it. And with that, we can do it. If we have enough energy, we can do anything. And therefore, I think, if I have to put my finger on the crux, it's make sure we have enough energy for the future. And that's a matter in which I'm by no means an expert, and I leave it to those people who are. Thank you. Lunchtime.